Hello and welcome to the Franz Van Cat interview. I'm Annette Young. For the last few days, the world's media has been flooded with extraordinary images of grieving North Koreans as they pay their respects to the late leader Kim Jong Il. For many, the scenes of mass hysteria seem contrived. But in North Korea, the culture of mourning has been magnified by a cult of personality in which the country's leader is considered to be everybody's father. Yet his death raises more questions than answers about the future for this nuclear-armed nation, a country that has the capacity to wreak havoc on two of America's strongest Asian allies, South Korea and Japan. Joining me now from Boston is Stephen Bosworth, who until 2 months ago was the US Special Representative for North Korea. Thank you so much for being with us. Firstly, these images coming out of North Korea seem to be overly contrived. Just how much of that grief is actually genuine?
Well, it's difficult to know. I think some of it is contrived and it's a bit of a sham. On the other hand, as you pointed out, North Korea is in some respects as much a religious cult or a cult of personality as it is a political unit. So I think there is a genuine sense on the part of many North Koreans that somehow they've lost their leadership, their leader, and they're looking to the next generation.
Certainly, despite years of speculation about Kim Jong-il's health, his death did come as a surprise even to neighbouring South Korea. Again, just showing us just how closed off this country is, even in this day and age of internet and social media. Could his death be the beginning of the end for such a regime?
Well, that's always possible. It is a different situation in terms of communication and knowledge than it was when he replaced his father back in 1994. But I'm certainly not anticipating in the near term that there is going to be any substantial change in the current structure in North Korea. They want stability. They all have a great stake in stability and continuity, and I think they will now exercise a form of collective leadership, if you will, much more collective than was the case under the father and the grandfather.
Which is something I want to talk about in a few minutes' time. But first of all, what do we know about his son, Kim Jong-un, who's been dubbed the great successor? I mean, he's very young, isn't he?
He is. He's less than 30. We know very little about him. I'm not sure there's all that much to know. His life story is very brief. We know that he attended middle school for a time in Switzerland. He was portrayed there as the son of the embassy chauffeur. He was not recognized as Kim Jong-il's son. But we know very little about him. North Korea, as you know, is a very closed place. They jealously, very assiduously guard the privacy of their leadership. He's had no contact, as far as we know, with the international press, and we just don't know. We don't know much about his temperament, and we certainly don't know much about his knowledge of the world. He has lived outside North Korea, at least briefly, but I would not expect that he's a very cosmopolitan personality.
In fact, that's something I wanted to raise with you, the fact that he was educated at some point, briefly, in Switzerland. Does that give any indication that possibly he might be more open to dealing with the West?
I think we know too little to draw that kind of inference. He apparently did, at least at some point, speak some English and perhaps some German. But I think, as I said, that he is a classic hybrid, inbred North Korean, a member of the leadership family.
Now, coming back to these reports that the country will shift to collective rule, what have you been hearing about that?
Well, I think it's not unexpected at all. The senior generals, the senior party leaders are not about to, I think, follow blindly the judgments of a man in his late 20s who's had no real practical experience in running that country, that regime, and whose knowledge of the country's institutions and its interests and policies is going to be necessarily somewhat limited. So clearly they need him He is the symbol of continuity of the Kim family. As you had earlier pointed out, it is to some extent a cult of personality. On the other hand, he very badly needs this kind of support. He has an uncle and an aunt. The aunt is the blood sister of his father, Kim Jong Il, and they are going to be, I think, key supporters of him. But he also is going to have to count on the judgment and support of the senior generals and the senior leaders of the party.
And as you pointed out, you've just outlined a few of the personalities who are close to him. Do we know any more about these people? And again, are they the sort of people who are likely to continue, keep the status quo in place?
We, in fact, know relatively little about any North Koreans because it's such a closed society and they have walled themselves off from the rest of the world. Some of these people have done some travel internationally. Many of them have been to China periodically, but we really don't know much about how they think. We don't know much about how decisions are made in North Korea. All we can do is sort of analyze what we think are their interests, and I think their interests are very much in the area of continuity and stability. They have a great stake in the survival of the regime. And I think we can expect, as has been the case in the past, that all questions, all choices that they make are going to be determined primarily by their judgment as to whether or not that serves the goal of regime survival and regime stability.
Now, there's much concern, Stephen Bosworth, that this period of leadership transition may prove to be unstable. Yet, in the face of such unpredictability, analysts are saying there's little that foreign powers can do except wait and see how things turn out. Is that the case as you see it?
Well, I think there is a certain necessity to be patient and to wait. On the other hand, I think it's also important that the United States in particular, China will do this, continue to attempt to engage with the North Korean regime. I think that this is not a time to allow them to sort of drift untethered in the world. They need to know what the United States is going to be doing, what our views and positions are, and that provides something in the way of an anchor of stability for them. We can't allow them to become uncertain about what we want or what we are prepared to accept. So we have to continue, as we have over the last few months, to engage with them as we can. I met with them twice in recent months, once in New York in July, and then last in October in Geneva when I introduced my successor to my counterparts there. So I think this kind of engagement should continue. I expect that, at least in this case of the United States, it will continue. And I expect also that the Chinese, who have more extensive relationships with the North Koreans, are going to continue to be engaged there, to try to engage the leaders, including the new leader.
And as you just pointed out, the Chinese are just as equally concerned as anybody, I imagine, in all of this.
In some ways, more concerned. I mean, after all, they're right next door. The South Koreans, of course, are very concerned. But the Chinese, they have a substantial policy and political and economic exposure in North Korea. They have to be very attentive to their interests there. They don't want to see North Korea collapse. From their point of view, that would be a very negative development. And they also don't really want North Korea to continue to have nuclear weapons programs. So in that sense, their interests and U.S. interests coincide. But it requires continual and close coordination with the various parties of the region, including, of course, the Japanese and very importantly, the South Koreans.
There are reports that only last weekend an American envoy was meeting with the North Koreans to discuss resumption of food aid to the impoverished country in apparently exchange for a halt to its uranium enrichment program. Are you able to confirm that this indeed did occur?
Well, I think there were meetings. I am no longer at the center of U.S. policy on this issue, so I understand that this is indeed the line that we were exploring. It's the same line that I was exploring when I was the U.S. representative. So this, I think, it reflects some continuity of U.S. policy, and I expect will probably reflect continuity in North Korean policy.
So what we're seeing is both the Americans and its allies appear to be moving gingerly back to resumption of those six-party talks with North Korea and, of course, involving South Korea, Japan, China and Russia. Do you think that is indeed going to happen, especially given now that Kim Jong Il is dead?
Well, I think it's always hazardous to predict what might happen with regard to North Korea. But I think it can be said that all of the countries concerned hope that that happens and are going to continue to work together to try to bring that about. The North Korean nuclear program is a distinct threat to stability in the region and indeed stability on a more global basis. So all of us have to work very hard to try to create a situation in which that threat can be first capped and eventually, we hope, over time eliminated. But that's going to be a function of very difficult, very complex negotiations, and all we can do is try to bring about the conditions necessary for relaunching those negotiations.
Stephen Bosworth, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for being with us, and that's it for this edition of the France 24 interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up very shortly.